But my role today is essentially to introduce the speakers and chastise them if they go too far over time. I think what we will try and do, if possible, is keep questions to the end. If there's a little bit of interaction and our speakers are fine with that, if they are, then perhaps that's okay. But if at all possible, if you could hold any questions or comments at the end, and we'll try and make sure we've got 10 or 15 minutes for a broader interchange. So our panellists today, starting from my right, Simon Green, he's Director of Policy at the IPA, Chair of the International Young Democrat Union. He's, of course, a commentator on policy and indeed on politics across the nation. He's got a regular presence in terms of broadcast media, and he certainly has expertise on a range of policy areas, from freedom of speech to the rule of law and red tape. He grew up in central Victoria. He's a passionate supporter of Hawthorn, which we won't hold against him. And he also holds a Bachelor of Arts and Bachelor of Laws from the University of Melbourne. John Hennessy in the centre there is the Sector Development Manager with the Municipal Association of Victoria. He has worked with councils to embrace deliberative democracy, essentially under the Future of Local Government program. And prior to joining the MAV, he's worked as a corporate planner for both Toyota Australia and for the AFL. And Iain Walker on the left is Executive Director of the New Democracy Foundation. He holds a Masters of Public Policy from the University of Sydney and a Bachelor of Business from UTS. And the work of his foundation has been described to me as focusing on systemic structural reform based on a complementary role for randomly selected everyday people interacting with elected representatives. So that's our panel. Would you welcome them, please? So, starting with alphabetical order, of course, anyone who wants to start?
I'm happy to beat a straw man to be beaten.
Yeah, I'm the deliberative democracy sceptic, so we might start with the positive case first.
All right. I'm happy to lead off, thank you. I did see in the invitation today there was almost a little bit of a provocative statement. Do you want to supplement or subvert? It's not about subversion. It's not about making people's lives harder. It's about recognising that right now we think the core problem with our system, at all levels, but we'll focus on local government for today, is that we build systems that are excessively responsive to public opinion. So you can get 5, 10 people together in a community group, you can destroy a public decision that affects 100, 130,000 people. It's not representative, and once it's not representative, how is that part of a democratic decision? I look at the ways that citizens already have a role to play in our system, and it is an objection-based mindset. If you look at any decision, whether it's a planning approval, whether it's feedback on any particular program that the government should go ahead with, it encourages people who don't like something to respond. Think about it yourself. If you see an announcement made that says your council is planning on introducing this service or changing this rule, if you like it, you'll look at the bit of paper and say, oh, that's good, and get on with your life. But if you're one of the people who loses out, by God, you'll make a lot of noise. And then the only feedback that government hears is that of the losers. And you can take this from large-scale freeway projects, you can take it to budgetary issues. And I just wanted to share a tiny little anecdote and then step through what we see as the principles of a good decision. And of course, unsurprisingly for me, yes, those principles are things you would see in a deliberative democracy approach. We often get asked by councils, the City of Melbourne was one of them, but we've also done it across Sydney, to be approached on budget balancing kind of topics. And if we get together a cross-section of citizens and we show them the whole budget and essentially asking them what services do you value, what are you prepared to pay for, how can we live within our means, they were able to solve this task. And we did one of these a number of years ago, and in short, this inner city council had about 152 parks and play areas. And citizens loved them. And it was only when they saw they all looked like the MCG with their perfect cross-cut glass, that's what everyone asked for. But when citizens looked at the overall scope of what it cost them and saw they were paying $1.34 million per year to service that, they actually liked them a whole lot less. And their recommendation back to the government was, look, we love how pretty they look, but you're mowing them every 2 weeks. Mow them every 3 weeks. You should actually be able to knock out between $450,000 and $550,000 on that. And a councillor said to me, how are we meant to know that stuff? How could no one's ever come to a council meeting and said, mow my park less often? I said, think about who comes to council meetings. People who want something. Because the park is across the street from them, do better. Build a pond, improve the function centre, change the hours. Because you're listening to all the insistent voices coming through the door. I know you've got to listen to them, but I'm suggesting that you balance them with invited voices, much like a jury. Because why did those people come to a different set of recommendations? Because instead of being in a wish list environment, they're in a trade-off environment. The analogy I love to give is with a criminal jury. When you think how you're going to make a trusted public decision anywhere, I always like that test of if I was arrested, potentially if Simon and I are on conspiracy charges of some sort, we would not think, well, whoever comes to the court and yells the most for our imprisonment, that's who we should listen to. I think that's an appalling way to do it. Equally, if you let a jury be self-selected, you would get 6 members of the defendant's family, 6 members of the victim's family, and say, go and work that out. Our challenge in government is that you see that there's a distribution of views that follow a bell curve, and our main systems today really reinforce hearing from the two edges. By deliberative principles, what do we mean? There's 5 points, but really I can distill it down to 2 in the interest of time. I want people to consider a disparate range of information sources. Don't just listen to the government view, or don't just listen to the action group that is punching every piece of information that you see. Hear a range of views and have equal share of voice. Do we do that today? Often people have 0 sources. They just have a complaint. And they do not believe in equal share of voice. They believe in their own voice to the exclusion of others. I actually think that makes life really hard for councils. And therefore, how can we, rather than subvert our councillors, what actually makes their life easier is having a group of citizens who have read and considered and said, you know, initially my opinion was X, but I read and heard from these groups and these reports, and now my view is Y, and we will trust them. We trust juries today. I'm going to challenge you to say, you may have heard of a jury verdict. There's been a defamation one recently, for example. Whether you agree or disagree with the decision, you don't distrust it. I think that was the Fairfax case that recently came through with Chris Gale. It's not whether you agree, it's not a right or a wrong answer. But did you look at that and think, gee, I bet they had a little reason for doing that that I don't really trust? Compare that with public decisions. A mayor can change how often the bins get picked up and people will see the conspiracy. So really in this whirlwind tour of what's the advantage for deliberative democracy, we live in this hard wish list environment where there's an impossible number of demands placed on councils. Someone needs to move the community beyond the wish list and into the trade-off environment. And it's simply, in my view, too much of a request to put 100% of that on elected representatives. If we can share that with a jury of citizens, not in a public opinion sense, not in a quick plebiscite off the top of your mind, but immerse them into a topic for a couple of months. Most of our projects are 50 plus hours of citizen time in the room. If they can find common ground and they will stand alongside the elected representatives, we think that improves public trust. So I think that's the case I would make for citizen deliberation in councils, is that let's look at how we make decisions today. We make decisions too responsibly to public opinion, and we put people under the threat of appearing on the front cover of the local paper. And we need to share that, not by saying to governments, ignore public opinion. That's a ridiculous request, but by giving them something better than public opinion, which is public judgment. So I hope that's... I haven't quite convinced the front row.
It's outrageous. I don't think I'll waste my time.
Well,
I thought it'd be the most stupid idea I've ever heard.
Today, or... I mean,
and that's competition.
I think on that note, son, your work here is done.
I might go next then. So, there are a few things. I'll start at this point. I think that a lot of the problems that are identified by deliberative democracy theorists are right. I think they've raised a lot of really significant issues with democracy, and one of those problems is that politicians, by the nature of the fact that they're human beings and by the nature of the system that they have to work within, are very responsive to a relatively small group of people. And a lot of the time that small group of people are people with the means and those with, when it comes to making decisions about corporate governance, for instance, tax rates, regulation, all of these issues. There's a reason why companies spend a lot of money on corporate affairs departments and on lobbyists, because they know that there are decisions that they are able to get made through the political system that currently exists by making sure that those people are as close to the decision makers as possible, and getting them to Canberra or getting them to the Victorian Parliament, for instance, is a really good way of making sure that that happens. I've got a pretty significant problem, though, with the idea of a jury-like system. I think that's a really good analogy, but one of the problems that we have with a jury is that they can only make a decision based on the evidence that's presented to them. So it's not up to the members of the jury to determine what's important. It's not up to members of the jury to make a decision that might be outside of the arguments and the information that's put to them by, in a legal system, the two advocates on either side of a legal case. So I think that's actually quite a good analogy to draw, because one of the significant problems that deliberative democracy as an idea has is that someone at some point has to make a few decisions. One, they've got to make a decision about who those invitations go out to, who becomes a member of a citizen jury. Two, they've got to make a decision about what kind of information is presented, the form of that information, the tone, for instance, of the language that's used. And I think that adds in a number of biases into a system which doesn't exist in a system which allows for anyone to be able to make any argument they like in what should occur in healthy civil society. I mean, a lot of what you've described is what should happen in a healthy civil society environment. You should have, of course, deliberation. Deliberation's what should go on between citizens making decisions about policy matters that might be before a parliament or before local government. But I think that the worrying idea about deliberative democracy is it says that the power of the state is going to be extended into civil society. It's going to co-opt civil society. And that, for me, is the most significant concern. The other thing I think that's really interesting about deliberative democracy is the kind of decisions that are likely to be made and the kind of arguments that are likely to be accepted, because you'll have to put in place an accepted communications framework, I think are going to disadvantage certain groups of people. So one group of people who I think is likely to be disadvantaged, and conversely a group of people who I think are likely to be advantaged, for instance, people from backgrounds where they don't have university degrees. I think it's much more likely that the kind of deliberative democracy that we've talked about, that we've seen over the last few years, we've seen bits and pieces of this starting to happen, but a lot of deliberative democracy, I think, favours people who have gone to university, who have the kind of things that we would describe as being critical thinking, analytical skills. And I think that does mean necessarily that you're going to leave out of that system a group of people whose voices are just as legitimate, who have a right to be heard, but who are going to be disadvantaged through this system. So that, I think, is a significant concern. And one of the reasons I raise that is because I've got a principled objection to it, but I also think that it's likely that practically you would see a backlash against a system like this. Similar to, I guess, what we've seen in some parts of Europe, for instance, in the United States, in the UK, where I think the more that you move towards a system that looks as though, whether it is or not, it's advantaging a set of elites, for want of a better term, you're more likely in a scenario like that to see a significant backlash to it. So I think in order for a system like this, and in order for really any democratic reform to be successful, you've got to make sure that you're speaking to what is a fairly large proportion of the population who don't necessarily feel as though communicating in the way that we would probably set up that framework of rules about communication. And I think that is probably the most important thing in terms of ongoing legitimacy of any deliberative democracy system. I think those are my key objections, but I think what's really coming from this very elite class of people that we're from, what is actually a really interesting thing to do is to have a conversation about it. So I'd love to have a bit of back and forth and some questions from the audience. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon. John, do you want to...
Just quickly, we've got a process at the MAB or program called the Future of Local Government. We've been discussing these concepts and notions now for the last year or two, so I've just extracted a few key points just to quickly go through them. But just to start off with the fact that the future shock is upon us. Our system of governance is broken. There's a crisis of confidence in government and in governance. People are forecasting more change happening in the next 20 years than we've seen in the past 300 years. And we've probably come to the crossroads in the sense that for the first time probably in our civilisation, trust and respect for the three major pillars of society being the government, the church and also business has broken down almost irretrievably to the point where people are becoming completely sort of disillusioned and openly challenging the status quo in a way that hasn't been seen for some centuries. So I think, as Richo says, the mob's not happy. Representative democracy is under threat because citizens play a largely passive role. Deliberative democracy, on the other hand, is growing in popularity. People power movements with citizens' juries, neighbourhood projects, participatory budgeting is spreading like wildfire across Australia, just in a whole range of dimensions. Society's become so complex that increasingly government cannot or is not capable of delivering solutions to the major challenges we face today: climate change, technology, obesity, homelessness, loneliness, poverty, inequality, the ageing population. So the old model of the public sector taking submissions and then going behind closed doors and making decisions has almost come to a finish because it just doesn't work anymore. It just is not capable of actually delivering what our society is requiring. So we do need to develop a new social contract with the community in a time of system disintegration. The nature of democracy is just moving from representative democracy, where we expect an elected person to act in our interests, to more of a participatory democracy where we encourage and reward personal initiative and community empowerment. So we change from how can we to why don't they? From why don't they to how can we? And it's becoming evident that every issue demands a localist response if it is going to work. And increasingly, the more the state and federal politicians become more and more removed from decision-making at the local level, the more they become so incapable of producing a localist response. So to move the paradigm for community members and residents from being consumers, customers and clients of other people's services and programs to become citizens, co-owners and co-producers of what happens in their streets, suburbs, towns and cities. To put a slightly different sort of gloss on that, to strengthen local democracy, to put citizens in control of their own lives, communities and services. And this can be achieved by focusing on local governance rather than on local government. So we do need to look at place and to start managing places from a local perspective, much more than sort of generic programs that keep coming out from Spring Street and from Canberra, and expect them to be able to make a difference at the local level, because increasingly they're not capable of doing that. The hierarchical model needs to change to recognise the importance of distributed leadership, to focus first on people and places and not programs, to encourage local priority setting and also resource allocation. So our current system of governance is not actually established or isn't set up to create great places. So we would claim that it does need to be reformed to enhance the power of place. More multi-sector partnerships will emerge. We've seen a gradual reduction in service delivery by governments, and the government is tending to move towards being a co-designer, a manager and a steward of systems. We need to introduce localism into the federation and achieve people-powered public services and provide citizens with more control over their lives. And I think we're seeing this increasingly on a global scale in terms of the democratic process. To transition to greater subsidiarity, pushing responsibility in the public sector down to the local level as much as possible, and participatory democracy by establishing inclusive governance models. The Maya Foundation here in Victoria is currently sponsoring the Neighbourhood Project, where councils are starting to admit now that they have to learn how to be community-led, because for the last 100 years councils have been the expert and they've been delivering services to an increasingly dependent community. The neighbourhood project, we had, say, 3 pilot councils in Victoria last year, just sort of making decisions at the local level about sort of what can be done to start using public spaces which are not being used to be used much more effectively, and rather than the council make the decision, start to pass the responsibility over to the community. And I said the CEOs of those 3 councils have said publicly that for the first time in their history they are starting to learn how to be community-led. In Tasmania, the council down there has now established a community advisory board, which is following the line of the New Zealand community boards, where the councils over there are now pushing responsibility down to the community for a whole variety of decisions, and also allocating budgets as well. It's not just an extra level of government, it's just pushing down the governance to the community and to get them involved in the process. So we do need to protect the commons, and just on a global scale, cities such as Bologna, Ghent, Barcelona, etc., are now starting to decentralise power back to communities, and the results in some cases have been extremely positive. And we would also note that the new Local Government Act here in Victoria, which will be promulgated early next year, one of the sort of foundation stones of that is participatory democracy. Thank you.
Thank you, John, and thank you all our speakers. We can try and be a little bit participative in this conversation. I think there's certainly probably room for plenty of exchanges between our panellists, but we might try and bring everyone in. Can I start, John? You're talking about the need for setting local priorities. If I take off my local government hat and put on my Shadow Minister for Finance hat, and I think about the $65 billion budget that this state currently administers, how do you get local communities to determine priorities when there are extremely limited resources to be spread across the state? And obviously, as we're constantly told, I must say with roads in particular, that there are other priorities apart from particular local ones.
Well, if you look at, say, roads, probably one of the greatest areas of waste in the public sector in Australia. In Gippsland now, we've had VIC Roads, who was supposedly the state expert in road making in Victoria for the last 100-something years. They've passed over responsibility for managing the roads in Gippsland to Fulton Hogan. Fulton Hogan is now making decisions in conjunction with councils on how to maintain the Gippsland roads, and they've achieved an improvement in the maintenance of those roads by 37%. And that's because rather than having, say, separate buckets of financing for maintenance and for upgrade engineering, etc., and sort of some bureaucratic approach to managing roads, is just put all the money into one bucket and apply it to areas of greatest need by using big data tools to identify need, such as the garbage trucks when they pick up the garbage. Where's the pothole? Fix the pothole and stop the pothole happening in the first place. So a 37% improvement in road funding in Gippsland by being smarter and also using perhaps information and feedback from the community. Lots of examples where they've actually started in some cases to ask the children how to design the school playground. The parents have then become involved in actually building the school playground rather than the council having to build the playground and spend $2 million on some masterpiece. I mean, there's just a whole raft of activities where we could be saving massive amounts of money if we can be a bit smarter and a bit more bottom-up in the decision-making process.
Just 2 things to consider on that roads question. We were approached by Infrastructure Victoria last year for the project on infrastructure priorities. And if you may know, the chairman, Jim Miller, he's ex-Macquarie Bank. He's not prone to flights of, hippie fantasy. And it was a very, very detailed initial conversation, it's been nicknamed the waterboarding internally because it was very direct on the far longer list than yours, Simon, on why this wasn't going to work. And eventually we essentially said to him, "What's your problem?" And he said, "People have a wish list. I want a train to the airport. Do you know what it's going to cost? No, but I want it." And what can make particular roads question easier is to say to people, "What do you want?" "No, this is what it's going to cost. This is the impact on how you're going to pay for it." And sometimes it serves to reduce demand. So there's 2 examples I'd encourage people to look at with particularly a public infrastructure renewal question. It's getting people to show a willingness to pay, getting them to deprioritise some things. One of the things we've mainly seen at local government, which may have huge infrastructure backlogs, is when people look in detail at what they are, and we've seen councils with $7.5 million of pavements, people go, $7.5 million of pavements. Put spray paint on the big cracks, fix anything that's higher than 12 centimetres. We're not worried by the rest. It actually lowers the load on government when people see the trade-off, instead of saying, you've got a cracked pavement outside your house, do you want it fixed? Yeah, because it costs you nothing. So I think what we do is we're just trying to move people beyond their 5-second response into a considered response.
Simon, do you want to try it?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think this comes back to a lot of agreement about the problems that are identified. And one of the things that I think is really important is giving people those tools to be able to make those decisions. But I think part of the problem is we're operating from a position of saying, well, government makes a lot of these decisions behind closed doors. There's a lot that decision makers can do without the public really knowing much about the facts that are before them when they're making that decision. And so I think part of the solution to all of this is to have more transparent government. We don't necessarily need to go to this next step of having a group of people who are chosen by whatever mechanism making this decision themselves. We still don't know if giving people the opportunity to go and have a look at how much is being spent on X, Y, or Z problem is going to lead to. So one of the things that I think is a really good idea is having a searchable database that you can go and look at, which shows you exactly how much projects cost, and whenever someone through a tender process gets a government contract, going online and seeing how much money the government is giving them to provide a particular service seems to me like, as a member of the public, a really straightforward, sensible idea when it comes to accountability and transparency. We don't yet have those sorts of mechanisms in place. At the Commonwealth, to some extent, you can do it, but certainly state governments don't. And there's a lot more we can do on the transparency front, I think. And I'm strongly in favour of doing that. I think it's a really good idea because at the end of the day, you want people, when they go to the ballot box, to be able to have the decision, to be able to have the information to make a decision about who they're going to vote for.
Can I just pick up on one point there?
Yeah, and I'd like to throw that.
Sure. Transparency is kind of in the harmless but pointless category because people don't read things. They have busy lives. They pick up their kids from school, want to go to sport, do everything else, watch The Bachelorette. There's a wonderful thing called the rational ignorance hypothesis. You're 1/16.2 millionth of a vote. Not us. Anyone read the Henry Tax Review? You pay a 5, 6, 7 figure amount of tax and you haven't read this. Why? Because your voice doesn't matter. I think government is assisted. If I can take just a sample of 50 to 100 people from all walks of life and say, you will get an answer from the Parliament. Not you're in control, you're not delegating the decision, but you'll get a straight answer. And it goes into some of the actually excellent queries and concerns that you had. We're a research foundation. I've encountered over half of what you hit and named. If I can get people to consider a range of sources, hear a Menzies Research Centre piece, an ACOS piece, the government's view, the opposition's view, and hear all those things and say, we see the problem, this is how we'll go forward. I don't think people will just proactively do that. I think the vote is a low engagement product. It's the thing that you've got to do on Saturday or you get fined. For a big swathe of the population, they're just not that into it. How do you make a trusted decision when they're just never going to read anything?
Yeah, I think that raises a broader point, and that broader point is if they're not that interested in the decision being made, is it appropriate that there are people making that decision? It does affect their lives. It's something that, you know, at some point some of these policy decisions that are being made will only affect them at the margins, but it's still affecting their lives. Now, if they're not willing to take an interest in it themselves when it comes to pretty hefty policy documents, for instance, and reviews and recommendations that are made. You're right, a lot of people don't really engage in that. But is the answer to that to say, well, maybe we take this decision away from this very small group of people and give it back directly to communities rather than having the state involved in those decisions at all?
Questions from the audience? Ken first, and then...
Yes, comment and a question for that. The comment is that the point that Simon made about open government transparency and what have you is how being addressed in Australia through Australia's membership of the Open Government Partnership. And I think that's an opportunity that more and more people should succeed to. But my question is seeking some clarification of the views of all three speakers on the relationship between the elected officials, the members of Parliament or the councillors, as the case may be, and these participatory processes. Because it seems to me that there has to be, it's really important that there's a link between that. To me, the link is that the elected officials are trustees who we trust to make decisions in the course of the electoral term, whereas with the participatory processes, we're talking more about specific projects or specific policy matters arising during that term. So I'd be interested in all three comments on the relationship between the elected officials and the participatory processes.
I'll be brief. Authority matters. There's a group of people who will go and inform the council at 6 a.m. on a rainy Sunday because that's a grievance that goes back a decade. But for me to get to a genuine random sample, you need to be able to look at the authority and say, okay, I know what will happen with that. Generally, we simply ask a mayor, tell me what's hard. And they'll do, well, everything's getting more expensive and I can't lift my rates. Do I want to be the mayor who cuts services or raises rates? It's impossible. So we share something that makes their life easier. Without authority, it falls in a hole because rational people don't give up their time to respond to governments that they think are already making a decision anyway.
I think perhaps in the previous time that the council had sat around the table as the experts who made the decisions on behalf of the community. In the last decade, we've had a massive upsurge in community planning across Victoria. There's now about 800 community plans across Victoria. Some councils have 20 to 30 community plans where the council's passed responsibility over to the community to come up with their list of priorities, and it's documented and etc. The council then goes away for a weekend in some cases and takes account of what's in those community plans to make better decisions. So the council will still make the decisions, but they need to make informed decisions, and they don't know what are the real community priorities unless they go through some very comprehensive sort of exercise involving a particularly high proportion of the community, such as community planning, and without that, the councils are just really shooting in the breeze, and the trade-offs, which you've just heard about from Ian, just don't take place in a say informed manner because the councils don't really know what's important to the community.
I mean, at the end of the day, citizens elect their representatives, and so the ultimate decision maker has to be the elected, whether it's local government councillors or whether it's members of parliament. I think the only way for this kind of system to be legitimate democratically is to say that they're an advisory body and they advise councillors, and you can work out whether or not their advice carries weight, but the vote at the end of the day has to be made by the elected representatives, I would have thought.
Yeah, I guess that's an aspect that interests me because obviously as an elected representative you've got to be accountable to the people that elected you. Citizens' juries, no matter how they're selected, are essentially accountable to themselves. To their broader community, but only in the general sense. There's no, if they get it wrong, the consequences are not there. So.
I have two questions that really relate to means and ends and relationship with life. I think the various ends or purposes that you promoted in terms of this citizen juries idea, and I think one thing that John and Ian mentioned was about this crisis in terms of citizen engagement. Whether you call it crisis or not, I think it's an issue. But if that is the purpose of this proposal, wouldn't we just deal with it in a very limited way? I mean, given these citizen juries, they're very reasonably costly affairs. Only a select group of people can be involved. So if we're thinking that the big problem to be solved is citizen engagement, is this perhaps, well, a very limited measure at the very least? The other question is this, that have we narrowed our focus too much? In terms of principles of deliberative democracy, is there a conflation here, Ian, between saying we might all agree that these two principles that you mentioned in terms of getting a spread of information and equality, equal voice, but then we sort of narrow our focus to say, well, the answer is this particular mechanism called citizen jury. I mean, why are we not looking at improving the processes of electoral accountability, the holding up of political parties, all the various things that we've been talking about, and trying to increase the effectiveness of those principles in those particular arenas?
To answer your second question first, you're right. Anyone who proffers a silver bullet anywhere should be thrown out. So we're a broad church, but there's a narrow piece. The person who funds our foundation was a long-term political donor and bluntly walked out of a fundraiser of an MP we'll never name because it would look partisan. and called the University of Sydney and said, who do I donate to who takes money, an organisation that takes money out of politics? And their response was, you idiot, you can't. Money flows like a river. You ban all donations tomorrow, which is what is a simplistic view that's thrown around, people will buy media outlets. You will have third-party groups. I agree with you. There's many things you could do on advertising regulation and term limits. There's many elements. But for us, and there's a couple of tests here. The Edelman Trust Barometer, it may be a report that you're familiar with. They do it obviously for PR purposes, for corporates, like who are you most likely to trust? You know who you're most likely to trust? People like me. You trust your neighbour, your co-worker, people you see on the tram. We look at that as, well, we know who people trust, so how do we make them part of the decision? I understand the electoral accountability model. I'm not pushing that too hard. I would gently note that we don't seek to elect judges, and we laugh at the Americans for doing that. By and large, we don't think, tell you what, we want to elect a judge, because then they have a perverse incentive to perform to earn re-election. So there's a balance. And all I'm arguing is that the balance is entirely one way, and that's not serving it. So the two kind of evidence points I'd look at is, for those who are familiar, the 2011 state election in New South Wales at the time was the most one-sided election result, I think, in a Western democracy at the time. The Labor Party ended up with 7 seats. I think the Libs were at 79. Local government elections followed a year later, and we did a project for a Labor mayor. And bluntly, he did it because he had nothing to lose. Let's look at the honest motivations driving behind that. And so we put a lot of resource in behind that. It ran in the Telegraph, it ran in the Sydney Morning Herald, and out of 152 local government areas, for those with a lot of free time, go on ABC election results and take a look, 151 swung to the Liberal Party. His primary vote went up. And he called me pretty excited the day after and said, mate, no one understands what you guys do, but they see people like them making decisions and they love it. I closed a budget hole by shutting things and putting up rates, and I've gone from 5.5% to 9%. That's kind of our advocacy in a nutshell of, we didn't ask that mayor to wear a hair shirt. Are there other things you can do to widen public trust? Absolutely. But there's something to this. And if it hadn't earned wider trust, frankly, he would have got caught up in that same tidal wave result. All we're asking is, let's keep testing it.
And also just to say, we probably shouldn't just be focusing on the citizens' juries. There's lots of other forms of participatory, apart from citizen juries. So let's not just focus on that as the only. Yeah.
I don't think I've got anything to add.
Iain Walker's my name. I live in the City of Greater Geelong. I certainly have sympathy for Iain's final objectives. It's been said that the human animal is easily distracted, and we certainly live in an age, perhaps an unparalleled age of distraction these days. I've been sort of making submissions to the City of Greater processes for about a decade, I suppose. And what I've observed that's been quite outstanding is that a decade ago, a lot more people were participating in the same way than today. You can go to a council meeting today where there are only 1 or 2 members of the public in the hours. There aren't 50 or 60 people there pitching for the particular street. There's virtually no one involved. That wasn't the case 8 or 9 years ago. In my view, if the review of the Local Government Act goes the way that it ought to, a lot of those sorts of problems where we can have meaningful participation and informed participation will basically evaporate. I just wanted to comment on that. I mean, I've got a whole raft of particular amendments that I think already made to the Act that I won't bore you with them here, but I just like a reaction to the general principle that there's a lot of scope to amend the Act which would actually turn around the level of informed citizen participation we see today that's declined substantially over the last decade.
Can I ask, have you noticed fewer submissions overall or fewer submissions from individuals?
Say that again?
Have you noticed fewer submissions to some of these processes overall or fewer submissions from individuals?
Overall. I know of people that used to make very substantial submissions that no longer do.
Because, that's interesting to me, but I think one of the reasons why that is because to some extent civil society is getting a little bit better at doing what it should do, which is getting a group of people together to put forward a submission on their behalf. So I think a lot of people feel as though, most people realistically feel as though they don't have enough time to put together a submission on their own, but they might say, well, there's another organisation out there that represents the same values that I share with another group of people, and on our behalf, we want these guys to put forward a submission. I work for one of these third-party organisations. The Institute of Public Affairs is one of these organisations that we've got 4,500 members. There's very few of them around the country that have the time or the inclination themselves to go and participate in a parliamentary process, but they are really delighted by the fact that there is an organisation that's doing that on their behalf. So I think that's probably happening right across the political spectrum. We're seeing, for instance, organisations like Get Up has obviously been in the news in the last couple of weeks, but there are lots of these organisations that I think are popping up, and it's not to say that if you see one submission from an organisation like that it doesn't necessarily represent hundreds if not thousands of members, and that as this process continues, it might lead to fewer individual submissions, but you'd hope that the quality of the submissions themselves is higher.
I don't think that's the case with the council. It might be the case with state government.
Yeah, and certainly the Commonwealth. Yeah.
You don't see anything from Get Up, for example.
Yeah.
Clearly, I take one example is the annual submissions to the budget. That's fallen away quite dramatically.
I think that's because people are smart. Most consultation exercises, it's the great where's Wally, because they say, here's our draft for consultation, now here's our finished version. And there's one page that goes inside that said we've got 58 forum comments and went to 11 community forums, but aside from that, they're remarkably similar. You do that enough times, why keep doing it? I'll push harder. I don't want, what are we the opposite of? We don't want government by Get Up. We don't want people organising and saying, here's a packaged view, just tick it off, we're looking after you. It does not encourage people to think. It encourages people to simplify arguments almost back into the wish list environment. There was an op-ed from Campbell Newman in The Australian a couple of months ago, and his view was particularly the right of politics should embrace deliberative democracy, frankly because the left's better organised. They will always, every day of the week, be able to turn out a bigger march, a bigger email campaign, any form of mass numbers. That's great, but that's not representative of society. That's representative of a group of interests who have time and motivation. But if I sample the population, I can't think of an instance where a random sample has aligned with a single lobby group. And again, I don't want to do the point to death, but one of the great comments I've had from a couple of mayors is, do you know who a mayor is really afraid of? It's netballers. Because if you've got a little girl who's about 6 to 14, she's going to netball on a Saturday. So do something they don't like, and that is a very organised group who can really have a lot of leverage on your quest for re-election. I'm not going to go into the pros and cons of netball, but the fact that you have a leverage activity on something without a lot of information, I don't consider that a democratic decision. I want a representative group of people, and if you trust statistics, then sampling is representative. And you raised some good questions around that, but I don't want to have probably not time for a mathematical lecture.
I think the City of Stonington will probably agree with you after last night's TV.
I missed that,
It was the bowlers versus the netballers.
Yeah, the netballers just finished off the bowlers in Chatston, so I think
We've got about 4 minutes left before the bells. Share out, so whether if there's any further comments.
One of the other things I from our panel might want to raise in that case is the idea of consensus. Seems to be one of the ideas that is thrown around. Do you think that consensus is a necessary part of this process? And if there is disagreement in a citizens' jury, how is that to be resolved?
I'd like to address that. You actually just 4 really good questions that I can just touch on briefly. Within our process, if I take a sample of generally between 43 and up people, we're seeking 80% of the room. So 8 people could sit up and say, We're trying to find common ground. How we do that is we don't do voting in the room. It's not show of hands, because once people put their hand up, they lock in. And once people are very conditioned to, if it's 55%, 45%, they brush their hand and it's done. What we get is people to put forward a contention. I would like $2.3 million spent on the netball and bowling clubs, and then ask people, can you live with it? What would need to change about that statement for you to live with it? And it's frankly why our stuff, it was raised on, I think, by JC, that our stuff is slow and expensive, because that takes days. But the advantage, if I can get people from all walks of life, blue collar, white collar, no collar, to say, I actually stand behind this is my common ground position, then I think that has an advantage for the elected official going, wow, this is a representative group. You can't touch on some of the questions you raised, because half of them we knew up front how to address, and half of them we've hit operational flaws along the way. Who's invited? You can do it off jury notices. A sheriff's office can roll it. We use land titles information because it's comprehensive. And then we frankly just match the census profile. So on average, 5% of people will give you 5 Saturdays of their time. They register in with 10-year age bracket, and this goes to a related question. We ask people if they own or rent where they live, because people answer that honestly. It's a very effective surrogate indicator of income and education. So our early projects were absolutely university education skewed. We sat there and looked at the room and went, we're not representative, we're way too high. The combination of asking that qualifying question, and across the side it's about 75-25 is the tenancy rate versus home ownership, and bluntly we pay people. So we average about $100 a day for people to turn up. So if someone needs to skip a shift, get childcare, is disabled and needs a specialist taxi, it makes it accessible. And bluntly, it was like flipping a light switch. It's not perfect, but it's better. It's that, well, we've got a generally representative group here of tradies, small business owners, bluntly a couple of people unemployed in public housing. If they can find common ground, does that make your life easier? And to the person who is writing to his council, our offer is this. If you're not getting an answer from your council, it's a chance to make your case to 30, 40 people I picked from around the area. You've got to live with it if they say no to you. But if they say yes, look at the authority, because council will respond to that. And the only other, what's the real product here is, where's the biases around information? You're right, that is a huge mechanism that we pay careful attention to. We let all the active stakeholder groups plus government make their position. It's about lining up. So, look, that does a little bit to your train of thought. No, I think the core point I wanted to share is, look, you actually open up and let a jury ask for their own trusted sources of information, and particularly MPs who've witnessed our processes have sat there and thought, that's a really interesting exercise in getting beyond the most insistent active interest coming to your door, and actually broadening that range, because what they synthesise is then available back to MPs or mayors and councillors. So it's longer than we did today, but I think you hit 6 questions which we're acutely aware of. But the one mechanisms, they are fixable. They're not showstoppers.
Okay, thank you. Given we're now out of time, is there any final comments from the panel?
I think a lot of the issues that Ian's raised with the current political system are legitimate concern, and I think lots of people hold those concerns. I love the idea of consensus, by the way, because I think at the end of the day, there's actually this really interesting example of this quite radical form of democracy that was used in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth back in the 1500s, where there was this free veto. So every single member of the parliament had to vote yes, and if one of them voted no, then the piece of legislation, the law, didn't pass. And the idea behind that is this quite radical idea of political equality. It said that every single member of that parliament was equal, and that even a majority position against a minority of one was a breach of that sort of form of political equality. So I think there are some really, really interesting ideas in this, and this is obviously a discussion that's been going on for hundreds and hundreds of years. But my solution to many of the problems that are faced by the political system, I actually don't think that there is a solution, given how big government has become, how all-encompassing the state is. So my solution to this is to really empower individuals and communities to make decisions themselves rather than the state having the power to make those decisions.
Just quickly, Dave, I think that this sort of discussion probably wouldn't have taken place 5 or 10 years ago, and in 5 or 10 years' time into the future, I think it'll be sort of front and centre in terms of our, what's happening in terms of decision making.
Really briefly, let us run trials. Take a look, come along, see what the information sources look like, but aren't trials good things to do? And thank you for everyone else for not leaving.